Hello guys, this is Ohio Dan. I wanted to do what should be a fairly quick video where I explain my position on is MGTOW a movement? And I'm going to start off by just giving my overall conclusion is that from a overall sort of reasonable definition of what a movement is, especially any sort of political movement, cultural movement, an overall movement in society, no, I don't think MGTOW is a movement. And I know there's been a lot of debate over the years. Most MGTOW guys will say that it's not a movement. Most men that are sort of in the men's community but don't consider themselves MGTOW seem to say that it is a movement. And I'm going to explain why I think that at the end of the day it really doesn't fit the definition of a movement, because it's actually more than that. So you can define a movement however you'd like to define it, right? You can say that a movement is just any sort of phenomenon or any sort of happening in society where people agree that they're part of this happening. Well, that's a movement. So you can use a definition that's really broad and consider almost anything a movement within the general environment, but that's not a very useful definition of what a movement is, because it doesn't tell you what is actually trying to move things in a certain direction in society versus what is not really having that goal in mind, versus what is not really a movement in the sense that it's cohesive toward a specific end goal. And that's the thing about men going their own way, is that there are a variety of different political views. I would say the majority of men going their own way today are right-leaning because of the way that the political zeitgeist is today, because of just the way that things are. The left is so anti-male, although you could argue that traditional conservatives are as well. But I've discussed this already when I talked about politics in the men's community. The general situation, I think, is pretty much dictated that if you have respect for yourself as a man, you're probably not going to be on the left. You're either going to be apathetic or you're going to be somewhere on the right politically, because there's really no room for men on the left anymore, except for men like Tim Walz, right? Men that are going to allow their cities to be burned down. Men that really go along with this very ultra gynocentric, women need to rule the world and men need to atone for their sins way of thinking. There really is no room for men on the left except for those men. And so men that are self-aware, men that are going their own way, men that are advocating for something different than that, they're not going to be on the left politically most of the time. There are some exceptions to that, and that's fine. But without getting into that anymore, the thing about men going their own way is that you don't have to be on the right. You don't have to care about politics at all. You don't have to want to see society reformed. The thing that men going their own way basically have in common is they look around and they realize, oh, okay, this society basically wants to exploit men. It wants to treat good men poorly and say that women can do no wrong and that men just are to blame for everything bad that happens. It wants to destroy men in the family courts. It wants to destroy men in terms of false accusations in the workplace. It doesn't care about what happens to good men, so there's no reason for us as men to invest in this society. There's no reason for us to get married in a system where marriage is a scam. There's no reason to live with a woman when the domestic violence laws basically say that it's her place in a de facto sense, because she can call the cops on you and get you kicked out of your own place. People talk about common law marriage and having to potentially pay spousal support. In Canada, I know that a guy went on vacation with a woman on a regular basis for long periods of time, and then when they broke up, he had to pay her spousal support. They were never even common law married for all intents and purposes, but whatever province that was decided that that was what was going on, that they were married, so to speak. So it's just a rejection of getting used. It's a rejection of exploitation from a guy's perspective. It's a rejection of going along with a system that is designed around basically scamming you and defrauding you from what you've earned in life, and saying that you need to have a woman to be happy, while at the same time setting things up so that a woman can just completely ruin your life. And it's just a rejection of that. And so unless you call the reaction of walking away from that a movement, there's really nothing else that men going their own way necessarily have in common with each other, other than just rejecting this idea of playing this provider protector role, but at the same time, we're going to take your family from you, we're going to take your career, we're going to ruin your life as we see fit. Women need to come first, you need to come last, and you just need to go along with that. It's a rejection of this standpoint that men should just be cannon fodder. And I don't consider that commonality to be enough to drive a movement. Now, those that want to argue that MGTOW is a philosophy or a lifestyle, I would tend to agree more with that. And here's what I compare it to, guys. MGTOW is more like the scientific method than it is, for example, the Enlightenment, which actually was a movement, right? MGTOW could be the basis. It could be the foundation in a philosophical sense, or a general, we accept these as our assumptions, or we know that this is the way things are, and therefore we want things to move in a certain direction. MGTOW could be the foundation for certain movements in the future if enough men do walk away from the system. Now, that could be from men themselves, that could be from the state trying to crack down on men, or even maybe trying to give men an incentive not to do this, right? There could be a political movement that reflects an understanding that men are walking away, but it's not men going their own way and the underlying ideas themselves. With the scientific method, back at the beginning of the Renaissance, the idea was, well, we reject the idea that, and this may be somewhat of an oversimplification, I'm not claiming to be an historian here, but the idea is these religious authority figures are telling us what right and wrong is and what we have to do, and we actually think that we can discover and figure out a lot of fundamental truths about the physical world around us by employing the scientific method, by actually observing things, by actually recording data and experimenting with variables and seeing what variables are connected and which variables aren't, and actually explaining the world through natural phenomenon instead of, well, I'm the authority figure and I say God says this, so you have to accept that or we're going to burn you at the stake, right? It was a rejection of this idea that the church could basically, in corrupted forms, right? Not God himself, but the church could say what the truth was. No, we can actually figure this out ourselves. We are going to turn our back on the idea that all these views, all of these doctrines should be decided for us. And we're going to come up with our own system of discovering what's true and what's valid and what's not, and what is observably contradicting of reality, or something that just isn't true. And so that's what I would compare something like men going their own way to. Now, the Enlightenment movement and the Renaissance, those things could be considered movements because they had the core idea in mind of, okay, we're going to use the scientific method. We're going to use the understanding that we can be rational and discover fundamental truths for ourselves. We're going to use this information and this knowledge as the basis for whatever political theory or ideology, or for whatever particular new religious sect, or for whatever particular direction that you wanted to take the economy or any other facet of society toward, right? It could be the foundation for a lot of different potential movements, or at least ideas or things that people could rally around. But when you consider two potential scientists that would have looked at the world during the beginning of this period and said, I agree that the scientific method is useful. I agree that this is a tool, this is a foundation for discovering basic truths. But you could have one scientist say that, well, to me, this proves there is no God. This proves that it's all BS. This proves that essentially we can know everything physical in the world, that science can provide all these answers, and therefore I reject the idea of a creator. And someone else could say, no, that's not the case at all. This proves that God exists because look at all the order in the world. Look at how we're capable of using reason to figure these things out. If there weren't a creator, everything would be so chaotic that you wouldn't be able to use something like the scientific method to reach these conclusions in the first place, whatever those conclusions would be. And so the only thing that those two scientists might have in common is that they agree that the scientific method is a valuable and useful tool for figuring out things about the world around us, but they may totally disagree on religion. They may totally disagree on what type of economic system they support. You could have all kinds of different opinions, even though you agree that the scientific method is a more useful tool than just people saying, well, I'm an expert because God says that I am, and you need to believe this and that. That, in my opinion, is what MGTOW is like. It is not like the Enlightenment movement in itself. It is not like a particular ideology that values the free market instead of some other system like feudalism at that time. It is instead an overall foundation. It's the bedrock that says, okay, this is how we're going to make our decisions. It's not a movement in any particular direction. It gives you a tool set to decide these things for yourself. It creates that foundation so that you can discover what it is that works for you as a man at the individual level. And I just don't think realistically that can be called a movement. There's not enough unity. There's not enough centralization. Now, you don't necessarily have to have leaders. I have heard people say, well, there are no leaders within MGTOW, so it's not a movement. Well, something like the counterculture movement in the 1960s, that really didn't have leaders either. I mean, you could talk about your civil rights movement. You could talk about the leaders within that. You could talk about different hippies, I guess, basically, but none of them really were a leader. There's no leadership. It was just a movement that was based on essentially the rejection of the society that had lived before that and toward other policies. It was a movement because the idea was anti-war or anti-poverty or whatever you want to throw in there. Like, a lot of people had different conceptions of what it was that they supported. Some of them probably didn't know what they were actually trying to create, but it was a rejection of the status quo. MGTOW really doesn't even go that far. MGTOW just says, okay, we do reject getting exploited, but we really don't care what we're moving toward. What we're moving toward is probably a train wreck anyway, and so we actually want to limit how much we have to do with that train wreck. It's not a goal-oriented thing, other than it's possible in theory that policies could be crafted because not enough men are getting married. The marriage strike provides a good example of this. The marriage strike, if it really became something that resulted in the majority of men just saying no to marriage altogether, and there would have to be policies or there would have to be a debate about it in the mainstream, and you would have men that were actually leading this, at that point you could call the marriage strike a movement, but that's from the foundation of going your own way. That's not the foundation itself. You could call the marriage strike a movement because it has a specific goal in mind, which is just men shouldn't get married, but MGTOW is more complex than that, right? It's not about the act or the decision not to get married. It's about why. It's about the overall environment and the overall status quo that leads to men choosing not to get married because the whole system is a scam. Choosing not to have kids because those kids can be so easily used against you. Choosing not to live with a woman because of the Duluth model. Choosing to basically stay away from women in a variety of different environments because we recognize that to a large extent women today are nothing but trouble for men. And so I don't think that foundation in itself is a movement. I think things like a marriage strike that result from that, if that would truly gain steam, and you could argue, some might say that it already has, I would say that it's not going to gain enough steam. If men were truly aware of the marriage trap, very few men would really be getting married today. So, I don't think it's resulted in a marriage strike on a wide enough scale to have the impact that we might think that it should. But I don't want to get into that here. The whole point is, I think that you have movements that can be based on MGTOW ideas, potentially. You could say that there's a movement to get rid of no-fault divorce as well. In my opinion, that's not going to gain enough steam either, but that would be a movement toward a policy, right? That would actually be something that would require some sort of organization. It would have to be goal-oriented and based on that one specific thing. MGTOW is not based on one specific thing other than, men, you're in a bad situation today. You're better off finding something else to do besides trying to have a family, unless that's so important to you that it's worth sacrificing everything else you could do for, because it's rigged against you. Dealing with women is a dangerous process today when it comes to the women that you'd actually seriously invite into your life and maybe have a close relationship with, or even a woman in your family that you're close to. If she decides to get violent, if she decides to call the police on you, she has a huge advantage. A woman that you work with that you might fancy and find attractive, she has a huge advantage if you choose to get involved with her. If you live with a woman, it's basically her house, even if it's technically yours, because she can most likely call the cops on you and get you arrested when she wants. And so I just don't think that recognizing that in itself and responding to that by choosing not to be a part of these games, of these scams, I don't think that in itself constitutes a movement. I think, again, you could have movements based on this, but I don't see that happening at enough of a level to really change things, or even if it does, the point remains the same, right? The point is that I don't think that MGTOW can be considered a movement because there's just nothing else we have in common necessarily other than not being willing to get used in the system. And without any sort of other direction or any sort of other thing for it to coalesce around, it could be the foundation for a movement, but MGTOW in itself isn't a movement. It's just walking away from getting used and exploited. And that's not the same thing as a movement toward a particular goal or thing, unless you want to define a movement so broadly that anything that you see around you is a movement anyway. But I pretty much reject that. I don't think that makes sense. I don't think that's useful. I think for all intents and purposes, MGTOW does separate itself from political advocacy. It separates itself from having a specific end goal in mind, and instead it's built around giving men good information to have the foundation to walk away from being exploited or putting themselves in really negative situations with women.